Okay, this lecture is going to give you some history and miscellaneous information related to the Python programming language. So we'll start out with some general information. You should have already seen the video on what a scripting language is, which is what Python is. But Python is considered a general purpose programming language. It was created by a gentleman named Guido van Rossum. This was a side project that he worked on while he was a programmer at CWI. He just kind of worked on this on the side. When he was trying to come up with a name for his language, he was interested in the BBC show Monty Python's Flying Circus, and decided that his programming language needed an interesting name, so he chose Python. One of the big advantages and nice things about Python is it is very cross-platform. It runs on Windows, it runs on Unix, it runs on Linux, it runs on Mac OS, which is technically Linux, an older operating system called VMS, a older OS by IBM called AS400, and then another IBM operating system called OS 390. And you can actually, the ones I've seen cost money, but you can actually get versions of Python to run on your iOS devices, and there are others, platforms or computers or operating systems that allow you to run Python. And Python is object-oriented, which means things are treated as objects. They have methods that allow you to interact with objects, and we'll start talking about the object-oriented aspects probably early on, but later in the semester there's a chapter from your textbook that is dedicated to object orientation or object-oriented language characteristics, and then another chapter on inheritance, which is another thing that you deal with and is a big advantage for object-oriented programming languages. As far as the history, I kind of worked through this, and I decided it was going to be easier to look at if we talk about the major versions of Python and then later talk about other things in minor versions possibly of Python. So I told you that Guido started developing this on the side. He started developing it in 1989. A couple years later, in 1991, in particular February 1991, he released Python to the public, and at that point he was calling it version 0.9. 3 years later, or about 3 years later, in 1994, Python 1.0 was released. And Python 1.0, 1.1, etc., all the minor versions in the major version of Python 1 were around for 6 years. So in the year 2000, Python 1 was declared end of life simultaneously with Python 2.0 being released. Then 8 years later, in 2008, Python 3 came out. You had version 2 and version 3 that kind of coexisted and were being used for development for a decade plus. And they're different enough that it's kind of an annoyance. If you were careful and programmed in Program 3 or Python 3, and you were careful, you could write a program that would also run in Python 2. But a lot of times you had to know this was written in Python 2, this other program was written in Python 3, so that you knew which interpreter to use to execute the program. Now, in 2020, in January, they finally end-of-lifed Python 2. So, you know, the theory is you shouldn't be developing any new programs in Python 2, that you should only be using Python 3. And for the most part, possibly exclusively in this class, we will only talk about Python 3. Unless I feel it's important to say this is how it used to work, or what you need to know if you come across something in Python 2, but here's how you do it in Python 3. But I think that will be very rare. Now then, the next thing I decided to do is talk about what are considered current versions of Python, and talk about when they came out and when the language will stop getting updates, and then when it will stop receiving security updates, which would be considered the end of life of that version. So 3.7 was released in 2018, and end of full support was June 27th of 2020. And you know, I'm recording this about 2 weeks prior to the end of security fixes or end of life. So 3.7 has been out for a while, 5 years, and it is going to be end of life. And that's, I think you'll see here that full support ends anywhere from like 1.5 to 3 years after the release date, but that end of life, end of security fixes, I think is these days always 5 years, but we'll see if that holds true in this table. 3.8 came out in 2019 and is scheduled for life in October of 2024. So, you know, that was about 1.5 years between release date and end of full support. 3.9 came out in October of 2020, and again, about 1.5 years later, it looks like, was end of full support. And then in October of 2025, it's going to be end of life for 3.9. 3.10 came out in October. It was scheduled for end of full support about a month ago prior to this recording. I could not find anything that indicated where they actually did that, but I'm assuming any day now full support will end for version 3.10, and it will be end of life in October of 2026. As far as 3.11, which is the most current version, it came out in October of 2022. So, you know, about 8 months prior to me recording this, and it will do end of support in May of 2024 and end of life in October of 2027. So there will, you know, be more versions coming, and they'll probably follow this end of full support, end of life pattern that I've discussed here. This information came from Wikipedia on a page called History of Python. There has been no current discussion of a Python 4 at this point. So for a while anyway, we'll probably just keep getting releases of 3. I had trouble getting information on this, or as much detail as I would like. When I used to teach the Perl class, I could tell you when Perl exceeded 5,000 users, 10,000 users, 100,000 users, and when different versions of Perl came out. I attempted to get the same information for Python, and I did get some of that, but not, as I said, in as much detail as I'd like. So what I was trying to do is find the years, the number of developers, and number of users, and find major breakpoints. Well, this is a pretty big jump because most things in the internet kind of start flat and go up very, very, very slowly, and then they kind of have an exponential climb. And it looks like Python followed that trend, but the first data point I could get was 2007, when they stated that there were 1 million people developing code in Python. 6 years later, in 2013, the number of developers were 4 million, and they declared the number of users was 100 million. So people that on a regular basis were executing Python programs. I would have liked to have had a lot more data points prior to that 2013 date, but I just couldn't find them. The next point is 2016. They claim that there were 500 million users of Python. A couple of years after that, 2018, they said that there were 1 billion people regularly executing Python programs. And then in 2019, they said that the number of developers exceeded 7 million. A year later, in 2020, the number of developers exceeded 8 million. A couple years past that, they said that it was 15 million. So those are all the data points I could get. I'll probably go back and try to get more detail, but that's what was available to me right now. Now, I told you that Python was a general purpose programming language. So there is a website called Statista that has statistics, and they do a survey occasionally. So what I'm going to show you next is a survey that they did in 2021 related to Python, where they asked people what they were using Python for. And for the people that responded, half the people said they were using it for data analysis. 45% said they were doing web development. 36% said machine learning. One of my favorite tasks is a couple below that at 34%, which was system administration. And then it goes down from there. So you can look at those at your leisure and see all the other things that Python is being used for. Another thing that I have is a list of companies that you probably know that use Python heavily. And the first one is Netflix. They use Python. IBM, particularly in their Watson environment, uses Python heavily. Facebook, of course they're going to be heavy in things like PHP and that type of thing because it is a web platform, but they consider Python to be one of their, I think, 3 primary programming languages that they use. Instagram, Google. I'm pretty sure at one point that Guido, the creator of Python, worked at Google for some period of time, and they are heavy users of Python. PayPal, Dropbox, Uber, and many, many more companies use Python as one of their major development programming languages. So that was some miscellaneous information and some history related to Python.